Now in Texas, all eyes are on the next legislative session, which starts in January 2025, where a vouchers-like plan seems more possible than ever before. CBS's Austin's Michael Atkinson has covered the school choice debate extensively, and he joins us here in the studio. Michael, how much more likely is school choice policy in the next session?
Well, if you believe what political experts and stakeholders say, school choice seems more likely than ever. High-profile Republicans, including Governor Greg Abbott himself, went after members of their own party in an effort to muster up votes for a vouchers-like plan. The question is, will that be enough? When the Texas legislature returns to the Capitol in January, one issue will be at the forefront of the scene: passing a vouchers-like plan, allocating taxpayer money toward private education. The chamber to watch, the Republican-controlled House, which has repeatedly voted against that kind of policy, between Democrats and rural Republicans who are skeptical of how such a plan would affect public school systems.
There is not a consensus on this issue among Republicans.
The Senate passed multiple versions of school choice legislation, but the House really only got as far as committee hearings, never bringing a bill to the floor. As such, Governor Greg Abbott and other top Republicans went on the campaign trail, endorsing primary challengers to the Republicans still opposed to vouchers. After the primaries in March, early signs indicate at least 9 new Republicans on track to join the legislature would support vouchers.
We want to have representatives whose constituents, by more than 80%, support school vouchers. We want those representatives to be voting in favor of it, and we will be working to achieve just that.
Polling from the University of Houston says a majority of Texans, around 2/3, support a school choice program.
Another important aspect is roughly 1/3 of Texans are very strongly supportive of school voucher legislation, which is about double that is strongly against them.
Notably, though, virtually the same amount, around 2/3, understood the arguments against school choice, namely that it could divert money away from public schools.
I think that's why this poll is an outlier. When you look at polling over recent months, it shows that a majority of Texans, 60% in the latest poll back in May, showing that a majority of Texans oppose vouchers.
You would say that this doesn't change anything for you and the rest of your caucus?
No, I think this poll is an outlier.
Republicans have been adamant the game has changed, though, mostly as a result of primary election results, ousting anti-voucher Republicans. Democrats I've spoken with still say their platform has not shifted. They're still as opposed to school choice as ever. But other holdouts have indicated that they're more willing to compromise on the issue, given how much the playing field has shifted after the primaries.
Michael Atkinson joins us live now in our studio to continue the discussion about school vouchers. You know, with the turnover in House Republicans, Michael, is school choice legislation within reach?
It certainly is within reach, Armstrong, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a slam dunk. There have been several representatives, as I mentioned, who are considered something of holdouts that have now either been primaried and are no longer in the Texas House of Representatives, or that they are now saying that they want to reach a deal. For example, Representative Ken King, who was a rural Republican holdout on school choice, indicated that he says it's more likely than ever in a panel that he recently spoke at. And he says that his goal now is to get the best deal possible for public schools, if that means reaching a deal on school choice.
You know, it's interesting because you mentioned that there is a Republican holdout saying that he wants the best deal for public schools, whatever that means. How closely, Michael, do you feel tied is the public education reform to a school choice bill?
It's been the fear among Democrats and some other lawmakers that school choice is going to be directly tied to public education funding, almost in a way that the wording that they've used is that they're being held hostage. That's Democrats as well as some rural Republicans who say things like they're worried that the legislature will not allow for something like a teacher pay raise unless they pass a school choice policy. But there are still some key Republican leaders, including State Senator Brandon Creighton, a Republican from Conroe, Texas, who chairs the Senate Public Education Committee, who says he wants those to be two separate policies. He does not want them to be tied together because he doesn't want any lawmakers to feel as though public education is directly tied to a school choice policy, almost in that hostage sense.
You know, it's obvious you care so much about this issue about school vouchers. You just want education to work for your children. You know, Michael also in his report tells us that the House of Representatives is the chamber to watch. And as we speak, there's a political battle for who should lead that chamber. Now, with that battle, affect the chances of a school choice policy?
That's a great question, and right now the answer is we're not exactly clear. So the battle at this point is with House Speaker Dade Phelan. He's the incumbent House Speaker and has served since 2021, presiding over what's been considered to be some of the most conservative sessions in Texas history. But some lawmakers have felt that he's not conservative enough. He presided over the Attorney General Ken Paxton's impeachment, as well as they said that he is not strong enough on the school choice debate, which has prompted several members of his own party, the Republican Party, to question his leadership and call for a new leader. The one that they have selected to be their sort of candidate is Representative David Cook of Mansfield. He is pro-vouchers, but for that point, Dade Phelan is also pro-vouchers and pro-school choice. So the question is whether or not, even if there was a change of leadership, if that is going to make much of a difference in the Texas House.
Well, I tell you what I appreciate. We really appreciate your keen insights, your doggedness about this issue and keeping us up to date. Thank you so much, Michael Atkinson, for joining us. One thing that I think everyone will agree on today, that there is a crisis in the classroom. And it's not just in Austin, Texas. We've traveled this country, and the crisis is everywhere. And every panel has a story to tell, but the panels across the country are so similar. And we're in Austin, Texas today, and we're discussing school vouchers and whether or not the Texas states, what will the governor do and what will the legislature do in January? We have people who really care about this issue. And so we're just so happy that Texas State Representative Gina Hinojosa has decided to give her time to join us today to continue the discussion on this issue. Jonathan Covey, who is the policy director for the Texas Values, Rosie Fierro Perez, who is the political director, the Texas Freedom Network, and Andy Ho with the Travis County GOP. I'm going to do something different. I want each of you to say to the people who are watching and listening to this broadcast, what do you see as the problem? What needs to change, what hasn't changed, and what has worked? And I'm going to start with you, Ms. Ferrero.
Can you repeat it one more time?
What is the problem? What needs to change with the education system?
I think there needs to be more communication about what students really need in order to succeed in classrooms, and focusing on
What do you think students really need?
a quality education that enables them to be successful in the future, that makes sure that they are represented in textbooks, that their teachers are properly trained, that they have all of the resources.
What do you mean by represented in textbooks?
In curriculum, often minority groups are left out or painted in a picture that is distorted and not accurate in our history textbooks. And I think it's really important for students to see themselves reflected in a positive way, in an accurate way, that they can see themselves as a part of this country and connected into their community and represented when they are in a classroom in discussion with their peers.
But Gina, as a state representative, does that create a sense of tribalism? And what is lost sometimes is the focus on the math, the English, the arithmetic. I understand that everyone wants to see themselves, but shouldn't all the classrooms be representative of all those things? And in the same process, you can teach kids so when they do graduate, they have a quality education, because that is truly their passport to the future.
I think teaching accurate history is a matter of right for every American child. And in this country, we are a melting pot of different cultures, different ethnicities, different stories. And I think it is only fair to our children to ensure that we are teaching that accurate portrayal of who we are as a country. Back to your question about what is the problem. As a mother of a child in public school, I just had one graduate last year, but as a mother of a child who's still in public school, I will tell you that I believe the problem is twofold. One, predominantly funding going to the wrong places. I sat on the Public Education Committee for the first time this last session, and I was appalled that every major piece of legislation that came before us had a significant portion of it, the main point of it being privatization of our public school dollars to pay a company that was being represented by well-connected, wealthy lobbyists, and too often we are sending our taxpayer dollars outside to these private entities as opposed to paying our teachers. And the second problem I see is that that parents who are in the classroom are not being given their due. In other words, parents who are, I don't know, and parents who appreciate the STAR test, but we keep doubling down on it in the state of Texas because we listen to so-called experts on it as opposed to parents and teachers who actually know public education. Let's focus on a back to basics education where we are paying our teachers, making sure we have manageable sized classrooms first and foremost.
Here. So Andy, let me start with you. Will passing new school choice legislation in Texas has repeatedly failed over the last couple of years. Will 2025 be any different? And if why, what will change?
I think so. There's a general shift toward school choice. We saw Governor Abbott make it a huge priority last session, and that may have been a big standoff and it didn't go anywhere, but I think even Speaker Phelan is starting to feel the change, and bringing Rick Perry in as an advisor I think is a shift toward a more libertarian-esque approach to it. So school choice may not be the ideal free market solution, but it's a way to make private school more the predominant paradigm. So I think that's something we're all looking at. We're seeing school choice succeed in states across the nation. And I think it's just time for Texas to do it, and there's a middle ground solution I think the legislature is winding up for, and we're going to see something that reaches everybody and is acceptable to most legislators, I think, hit the floor this session. So we're going to be surprised, I think, at the compromise bill.
No, I don't think I think everyone would probably say that certainly school vouchers is not a panacea, but Jonathan, have we seen evidence that school vouchers in Texas could have an adverse effect on public schools?
No, absolutely not. Actually, what we've seen is that school choice as a program, it brings more competition and it brings parents into the picture more. It gets them more involved. It empowers parents. Parents become more involved in their children's education, and when they become more involved, they become more happy with their child's education, and we have better learning outcomes, we have better academic outcomes, and we have better behavioral outcomes as well.
You know, Representative Hosa, you've opposed school vouchers. Obviously, you care about what is best for the education of all kids, and all kids learn differently. Do you see any value, even though you say it takes money away from other places that the money probably be more effective, do you see any value in the school voucher program?
The data that is really uncontroverted is that whenever taxpayer-funded vouchers are instituted in any state, there is drastic learning loss amongst students that is on par with COVID learning loss. So catastrophic learning loss. The data doesn't support that it is good for students. What we have never tried in the state of Texas is fully funding our public schools. Our schools rank, at this point, I believe it's between 3 and 5 at the bottom of states when it comes to per student funding, and we know our teachers are paid about $9,000 below the national average. We know that our students, we spend about $4,000 per student below the national average. We know that our schools are struggling with school safety issues. So on and on and on. I will tell you, as a mother of a child in public school, my son did not get a 5th grade teacher. We could not find anyone who would work for the pay and the conditions that AISD was paying. And so his class was cut in half, and his half of the class went to an already full classroom. We're putting our teachers and our students in impossible learning situations because we're not putting the money into the system that we need. The money, I believe there is plenty of money that we collect into the state treasury in the state of Texas, but currently we are hoarding it in the treasury instead of putting it into our schools, which is the best investment we can make.
You know, the CCO, the Texas Freedom Network, which you're a part of, you've petitioned against these vouchers. So obviously you can embrace much of what Gina is saying. What can you add or take away from the move for school vouchers? Again, I asked this question, is there any value that you see in if it passes in the Texas State Legislature in January?
I definitely agree with the sentiments by Representative Gina and Ahosa. I think something that is important to point out is the history of vouchers and where they come from, and segregation being primarily the focus. When desegregation was happening, a lot of wealthy white families didn't want their kids going to school with black and brown students. And so private schools emerged. And that is still hugely problematic now. We have private and religious schools that can discriminate against students and their families for any reason that they want. And these private and religious schools are not beholden to state and federal regulations the way that public schools are. They do not have to have the same accessibility requirements, for example, for students with disabilities, the way that you would with a public institution. And I think that's something that is really important to remember when we're talking about taking away money, public taxpayer money, away from our already defunded public schools and giving it to religious and private institutions that were founded on desegregation.
We must push back on that when we return, because there are so many families, particularly minority families, who've taken their kids and given them the vouchers. And what it has done for the kids' education, self-esteem, and progress has just been overwhelming. And while that's her story, there's much more to that story. We will continue this conversation on Crisis in the Classroom from Austin, Texas. I'm Armstrong Williams, and we'll be back.
To me, this seems not only reckless, it seems that it could do great harm to students, whether they're Christian or not.
You know, concerns are growing among some state lawmakers and public school parents after the Texas Education Agency releases a proposed elementary school curriculum, which includes using Bible teachings as historical fact. Welcome back to Crisis in the Classroom. I'm Armstrong Williams. The new classroom materials are drawing criticism for potentially violating the separation between church and state. CBS's Austin's Abigail Valles reviewed the curriculum and spoke with experts who say this is the latest push by Republicans to put more of Christianity into public schools.
It's unsafe for my children.
Lainey Hawes is a concerned mother with 4 kids in Texas public schools. She's been closely monitoring the new curriculum being proposed by the Texas Education Agency, which would merge new elementary school reading lessons with Bible teachings.
And it is not in the best interest academically.
In August, the House Public Education Committee discussed the new curriculum with TEA Commissioner Mike Morath, testifying the new teaching materials are based on research to help improve student testing scores.
The purpose is to build vocabulary and background knowledge.
Criticism quickly mounted when the released teaching material included biblical parables, songs, ideologies, and characters.
It sure reads like, you know, a Bible class that you might get at a traditional Christian church.
Bob Stein is a political science professor at Rice University and says he can spot 2 ways the curriculum could be in violation of the Constitution.
The Constitution doesn't allow for the establishment of an official religion. And what this particular curriculum looks like may not violate just the separation clause, but the establishment clause.
Austin area state representative James Tallarico agrees and is now accusing the TEA of prioritizing Christianity in the classroom.
If you're a Muslim student, a Jewish student, a Hindu student in Texas public schools, you already stick out. And now you're going to have your teacher at the front of your classroom preaching Christianity as the one true and only religion.
But Brian Phillips with the Texas Public Policy Foundation disagrees, saying some biblical parables are crucial to developmental learning.
Teaching people the story of the Good Samaritan as a way to understanding how to be a good neighbor, I don't see how that could be divisive or negative at all.
The new curriculum has not yet been voted on or rolled out to public schools, but parents like Lainey say this rides along the lines of indoctrination.
We cannot look at the history of America through a singular religious lens. We are a pluralistic nation, and this is anti-pluralism.
Reporting in Austin, Abigail Velez, CBS Austin News.
Before we get to the topic of biblical teachings in the classroom, I just want you to respond to Rocio and her experience and the issue of segregation as it relates to school vouchers.
Yeah, I think that strikes at two very different viewpoints on how our country was founded and what we come from. The reality is our education system comes from the one-room schoolhouse, and it was a community effort to build a school. And then came the school districts, then came the independent school districts that were independent of cities and counties. The state began to get involved, and in our times, through the 1990s, we saw the complete federalization of our education system. So I would have to say that it wasn't racism or segregation that pushed the massive move toward private schooling and charter schools. I think it was more like we saw that values that were alien to who we are as a people were being introduced into the classrooms. And I don't think it was because of white flight or any of those reasons. It was simply because of a cultural shift. The politics of fear and division and people in ivory towers not understanding what community values are here in America. And no wonder parents have chosen to go elsewhere, and now they're wanting to take their money elsewhere. That makes total sense to me. I don't think that's racist at all.
You know, Rocio, we know that debates on curriculum and instructional materials have heated up nationwide in recent years. As we just saw, this is happening in Texas right now with the curriculum proposed by the Texas Educational Agency. What do you think has contributed to this heightened scrutiny on public school teaching?
Well, there's a direct correlation between the curriculum and the push nationwide, not just in Texas, to indoctrinate and push Christian nationalism across the state. We see that through the Bible curriculum by TEA. If you look at the actual curriculum, there is teachings, for example, that would say that the resurrection of Jesus Christ was historically accurate. That is not something that I think needs to be put in the classroom.
Why?
Is it historically accurate? Did it actually happen?
But to many people it is.
Right, but that is...
But what about those that believe that that did happen?
Then it needs to be stated in a way that addresses that concern.
How would you state it?
Some people believe that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is historically accurate, but the depiction that it currently holds, it states it as accurate. And if you're talking to children...
Who defines accuracy?
Historians, teachers, professionals. I think it's important to talk to experts. We actually at TFN...
Do you feel you're an expert?
To my capacity, yes. But I'm talking specifically about people that study, that are religious scholars. For example, we did an independent study. We hired a religious studies scholar and Christian theologian, Dr. David Brockman, to do an individual study of the curriculum. And he found, as a religious studies scholar and Christian theologian, he found that this curriculum is placing Christianity above the rest.
How do you respond to what you're hearing, Jonathan?
Yeah, you know, I think that it's important to realize that Christianity is the largest religious community in the entire world right now. And it did play an outsized role in the founding of our country, in a number of different things related to colonization. So as we're teaching about history, as we're teaching about social sciences, it does come up as a very important topic. The Supreme Court has said that it has to be stated in an objective and a neutral manner, an academic manner, and I think it's done that in the OER curriculum as well. You know, you may not know this, but there are over 300 idioms in the English language that have to do with having origins in the Bible. You know, fly in the ointment, wit's end, my brother's keeper, all of these different things have to do with origins that come in the Bible. And so to have a correct understanding of our social sciences, to have a correct understanding of our culture even, we have to be able to understand some things and their origins from the Bible.
You know, Representative Hinojosa, you're on the House Education Committee, and as we just heard, some are worried that the inclusion of the Bible in TEA's curriculum would place teachers at risk of violating the law. In your view, is that a possibility if that does happen?
I don't know if that's possible, but this is a very frustrating conversation to me, because what these culture wars are a red herring for really big money leaving our public schools. This bill was almost $1 billion bill that came before.
Why are you frustrated?
Because the culture wars have come to our schools to distract us from the fat cats getting rich off our taxpayer dollars.
You think everything goes back to money and fat cats?
1,000%. And for anybody who follows politics long enough, they understand it's all, you always follow the money. And so for this issue, I've had agreements with MAGA moms who think I'm crazy for believing in masking and vaccinations, who agree with me that all these culture war issues that keep us fighting are a distraction from our public school money and from our taxpayer money being taken by the wealthy and well-connected. That's what we saw in this bill, and that's what we see repeatedly in the Texas legislature.
Andy?
You want to talk about fat cats? Let's look at the public school bureaucracy. Let's look at just how many employees there are, from regional student service centers to TEA employees. And why do teachers always get the short end of the stick? I'm married to a public school teacher, and believe me, I understand what's going on. It's the problem where they always say, okay, we want more money. We want $7 billion. The legislature says, okay, here's $3.4 billion. And then the education bureaucrats call that a cut. It happens every single session. And they always put their hand out. They always get more and more and more. But it's a constant vacuum. It's a black hole of funding, and the teachers never see a substantive pay raise or any benefits to really, you know, shake a stick at. So I think that's the big problem.
I'm going to give you a chance to reply.
Yeah, so when I talk about fat cats, what administrators make don't even compare to the kind of money I'm talking about to begin with.
Okay.
Secondly, a lot of the bureaucracy comes almost entirely from the requirements that the state puts on to our public schools. And so we are responsible for that bureaucracy at the state level. The Republican leadership of the state is responsible. And thirdly, let me say this, do we somehow think that privatizing and sending our public dollars to private schools with less accountability and less oversight is going to result at people at the top of these schools taking in less money? Where has that, what parallel universe has that ever worked in? So privatization is not the answer to giving teachers more money and cutting administrators' pay.
So, Ms. Ferreira, so even if you were convinced that there are parents all across Texas and all across the country that they've benefited and seen progress for their children who are in a crisis situation, you still see no justification in the voucher program?
I think it's wrong to take money, taxpayer, public money, from those that really need it in public schools and give it to the wealthy.
Have you seen the record on what public schools have produced across this country?
Do you know why they have that record?
Tell us why.
Because they're not funded properly. That's exactly what Representative Hinojosa said. We have never had a properly funded public education system in the state of Texas. Why do you think we're ranked so low?
Help us understand what a properly educated funded school system is.
Yeah, first of all, we don't have a funding problem, we have a spending problem.
Okay.
Right, because You take a look at superintendent salaries. The top 8 superintendents in the state of Texas make over $400,000. The superintendent at Cy-Fair ISD makes $535,000. The average school teacher salary is $48,000. There's a huge disparity. The average salary for a Texan is $57,000. On top of that, competition doesn't take funding away or siphon funding away from education. It's kind of like saying, okay, if you have a Sam's Club in your city and the Costco moves in, well, yeah, sure, some people are going to move, they're going to go to Costco instead of Sam's Club, but would you say that Costco is defunding Sam's Club? No, that's a silly way to put it. It's that they're finding more value for their money. They're going somewhere else where there is competition, where they're finding more value for their money, and competition is a tide that lifts all ships, so it actually makes public school and education, public education better as well.
Still to come, we look at school safety and threats and why the consequences can vary. That's next on Crisis in the Classroom, Texas. When we return, stay with us. Welcome back to this Crisis in the Classroom. Your voice, your future town hall. I'm Armstrong Williams. School threats are growing. It's such a concern across the state and across the nation, especially with campuses across Texas dealing with multiple threats in the recent weeks. While many are false, it still needs to be taken seriously and be investigated, which has an impact on students and teachers in the classroom, their families, faculty. The consequences for these threats can vary, ranging from school suspension for some teens to a 10-year-old being arrested. News 4 San Antonio's Stephanie Esquivel looks at why.
This hasn't just been a San Antonio phenomenon. There have been online social media type threats against schools all over the country.
Former Northside ISD Superintendent Dr. Brian Woods now works for the Texas Association of School Administrators. He told me there has been a spike in safety threats against schools all over the nation.
From my understanding, a student had a BB gun on campus. They had it throughout the whole day.
An SAISD teacher who didn't want to be identified says they were concerned over the district's response.
Students found out about it. They were very scared. And when they brought it to admin's attention, there was a lack of communication and there was no lockdown drill. And I think that was the biggest issue.
I reached out to SAISD. The district sent me the following statement. Every threat is taken seriously and our officers respond with extreme care following proper law enforcement protocols and full investigations. In this particular case, there was not an active threat occurring and our officers safely handled the incident per our protocols. School districts are legally required to have safety protocols and procedures, but it's up to each district what that protocol looks like.
The state says you must have a plan for it and you must have a protocol for it, and you have to have rules that you follow within your building. But the campus has to decide when to employ a lockdown.
Following the initial threat, Wood says it's up to police whether the student will face legal repercussions. As far as disciplinary consequences, that's up to campus administrators.
Two incidents that, at least from the outside perspective, look similar and you see different disciplinary actions. They're still both legal. They're still both doing what's required, but they're considering a whole range of factors when they're deciding what's the right discipline to do in this situation.
Stephanie Esquivel, News 4, San Antonio.
Our panel is back to continue this fascinating discussion. And let me tell you, I'm learning so much today. Let me welcome back Jonathan Covey, who's the policy director for Texas Values, and Andy Hogue with the Travis County GOP's Texas State, and Representative Gina Hinojosa and Rocio Ferrero Perez, who is the political director for the Texas Freedom Network. Jonathan, as we know, schools nationwide are dealing with hoax threats. Our station in San Antonio has reported on the different approaches taken by school districts in Texas. Do you think districts are taking the right approaches?
Well, you know, I haven't seen all of the approaches that you're talking about, but I think that, you know, making sure that we are attentive to our students, making sure that we're, you know, diligent to sort of assess threats, I think that's a big part of it. And I think school districts are, you know, doing a good job here in the state of Texas. I'm not sure how it's going nationwide, but sounds like at least there's a plan in place, and we're doing something that, you know, is sort of making sure that students are safe and secure, and that's, of course, the main goal.
You know, Rosa, you know, I got a specific question for you, but before I ask, what has shaped your values and your perspective more than anything else?
My culture, my family, community.
What do you define as your culture?
Mexican-American culture. We believe in supporting each other, in the family unit being more important than the individual, and relying on community for support.
You know, with that said, do you think families are being properly conveyed the consequences of their child making a threat, such as on social media, which is really impacting young people?
I don't think I understand.
What if the threats, do you think people really understand the threats that classrooms face? Because when you look at the threats that are made on classrooms with the gun violence, and sometimes these kids go to the classroom and act these things out. Teachers died, kids died, and these are babies. Do you think they understand? And a lot of this, sometimes they find the culture on social media that gives them the sort of impetus to do these things.
Right, I think you're placing a lot of the attention on those that are creating those acts of violence, but I think there is a large understanding of the real danger that students are in schools. It is the leading cause of death in the United States, gun violence in classrooms. I know so many kids that don't want to go to school because they're terrified of what could happen to them. And instead of passing gun safety laws, red flag laws that would prevent these things from happening, we're arming teachers.
But we're
providing tourniquets.
Most of the violence happens where guns are banned. It's a zone where you can't carry guns. So it's not happening in zones where you can. I mean, so do you actually think, and they have some of the toughest gun legislation across the country, but still these kids find a way to get into these schools and breach security and wreak havoc on the lives of the school. You think it's just guns? What about the parents? What about the parents monitoring what their kids are doing on social media? What about parents making sure they're not giving their kid a gun, like we saw recently of a case where a child clearly has mental issues, but the parents arm them with a firearm?
I think it's disappointing that we often use mental health as a scapegoat when the real problem continues to be the access that people have to guns. And in Texas, you can buy a gun at 13 years old at a gun show. We allow that still in the state of Texas. And so there is increased access to weapons of mass destruction that were never meant to be in the civilian world, like an AK-47, semi-automatic rifles.
Please add to this.
Well, first of all, AK-47s are not weapons of mass destruction. But I will say that I think that law enforcement has been doing a good job. I think especially school district law enforcement have made changes, and I think last session there were some changes put in place statutorily that required more school safety as well. So I think we're taking into account the threats. I do think parents need to be responsible and understand that this is very serious when you have a child who makes a threat online. It's very serious when, and I think that it's not a bad thing to make sure that parents know that they could be held accountable for the threats that are being made by children online.
You know, and last year a law went into effect requiring districts to have at least one armed security officer. Now, they say less than half of the districts it has surveyed has one on each of its campuses. Why do you think so many districts are struggling to fulfill that?
Well, one, I think it's a pretty grueling job. It's not really a job where you see a lot of action. You're standing there looking for a specter of school violence, and you don't really have all the power to intervene. The administrators do. They're the ones that handle the discipline, so the police officer is often there just kind of waiting to do something. It's a security guard position. Not a lot of people would want that. Secondly, I think there's a lot of disrespect that's shown to people in the public schools today. I don't know quite all the answers of how that happened, but I think there's a growing culture of fear and disrespect that we see in the hallways. And thirdly, I think that there's a just kind of a sadness about it all. Not a lot of people want to be around this thought of, man, our public schools are becoming war zones in the public opinion. But really, I think we need to teach our students how to be more resolute in the face of these problems. And I'm finding it difficult under current restrictions to get into my children's schoolrooms. I find it there are massive chunks of their school day I have no concept about. I have not been around. And I think we need to find that sweet spot between protecting our young ones, protecting our babies, and at the same time making sure that we're not teaching them how, the tuck and cover drills of the 1960s and 70s, and that we're not showing them the world's coming to an end, but we need to stand firm and stand up for ourselves. I'm not against police officers in schools, but I do understand it's not the easy job we might think it is.
You know, Gina, some education officials have said districts were not given enough resources to actually comply with that law. Your thoughts?
I think here, too, is an example of resources misplaced. The way the school safety bill was configured, the one that actually passed, Republican Representative Chairman Ken King had a different one that would have done it differently. I supported that one. But the one that passed gave a lot of the money to the TEA and made it about accountability. And for them to buy a fleet of cars is part of the bill, to buy a fleet of cars in the school safety bill, to go from school district to check in on the school districts rather. But meanwhile, our school districts are left without the resources to implement the school safety precautions that they need. So it was, again, misspent money by our Republican state leadership. But let me say this. I think I am born and raised in Texas. This was not a gun culture in my growing up. You could not have a concealed carry gun, much less open carry, when I was a kid in Texas. In this gun culture that we live in a culture of social media that is part of our kids' daily lives and adults' daily lives, again, something that we did not grow up with, I think that we need to spend considerable time listening to experts talking about how do we deal with school safety. I have asked our chairman of public education repeatedly, can we please have a hearing on our on discipline issues in our schools? And because vouchers is all anyone seems to want to talk about, which even if it passed would impact a small fraction of our 5.5 million public school kids, because most kids would still be in public schools. We don't even get to talk about discipline.
Hold that for me, hold that. I get it, I just hold that. Let me just do a quick break here. You know, Texas lawmakers asked Governor Abbott to address budget shortfalls when it comes to school funding. Stay with us for more on Crisis in the Classroom. I'm Armstrong Williams. Welcome back to Crisis in the Classroom. I'm Armstrong Williams. Earlier this year, more than 30 state representatives sent a letter to Governor Greg Abbott asking him to call a special session to pass increased school funding. He responded on social media saying, in part, there are several reasons public school districts are facing budget shortfalls. One is because federal disaster funding from the pandemic has now run out. As the finger pointing among lawmakers continues and children and teachers get caught in the middle, News 4 San Antonio's Matt Roy looks closer at how school districts are responding.
The reality is that today we need funding for public schools now.
That's what public school officials have been saying for more than a year. And still, despite a regular session and 4 special sessions having come and gone, no new funding has been passed by the legislature.
And what's happened is a number of school districts are now facing budget shortfalls, if not total budget crises, laying off people, primarily staff, but now possibly teachers, as we go into the summer.
We're anticipating probably a $90 to $95 million deficit budget.
Meanwhile, the political finger pointing continues. 39 House Democrats wrote this letter to Governor Greg Abbott asking him to call a special session so they can appropriate more funding to public schools. Abbott then wrote his own letter saying he and Republican Representative Brad Buckley worked on a $6 billion omnibus education bill and, quote, all the representatives who signed this letter voted to kill that package. UTSA Political Science Chair John Taylor says the only reason that bill didn't pass is because vouchers were included in it.
Because vouchers weren't attached, because Greg Abbott didn't get what he wanted. Basically, he ended up with school districts not getting their money.
In his letter, the governor also pointed the finger at the districts themselves, saying districts that put COVID-19 funds to the wrong use put themselves in this situation.
This is not an opportunity to blame students. I think the governor would be better served to support the schools.
We have worked extremely hard in our recovery efforts and getting students back on track, back on grade level. A lot of progress has been made, and so to not acknowledge that work, well, it's just a shame.
Right now, Texas ranks 42nd in the nation in per pupil funding.
When you lose all these staff people, when you begin to close libraries in schools, all as a result of the school finance mess that we're in, we're in a situation where students suffer.
Matt Roy, News 4, San Antonio.
Rocio, is there anything that gives you hope?
There's a lot of things that give me hope.
In terms of education?
The students that I talk to, my nieces, they give me hope. I think knowing that we have people like Representative Hinojosa that are fighting tooth and nail to make sure that students have the proper funding that they deserve, that gives me hope.
Gina, where have you feel that in a bipartisan way we made progress on this issue?
In a bipartisan way, we killed vouchers. I mean, that was unequivocally a stand for our constitutional Texas public schools. It was really inspiring the way rural, urban, Republican, Democrat came together, all walks, to take a stand in support of our public schools and against taxpayer-funded vouchers. That, I mean, there are few things we can do in a bipartisan way anymore. That one marked all of last year at the legislature, and it was basically it was all about Texas supports our public schools. That's who we are as a people.
Where could the parents do better?
You know, I think parents can continue to get involved in their children's education, regardless of school choice. But, you know, to your question of what gives us hope, I think that what gives me hope is that we are on track to pass a school choice program next session. We're on track to make sure that parents have options, to make sure that parents are empowered, to be able to be more involved in their children's education. Like we've said before, it's been shown time and time again, surveys show, polls show that when parents are more involved in their child's education, when they're shopping for their child's education, they're more happy with it. And when they're more happy with it, then you have better outcomes for students, you have better behavioral outcomes, you have better academic outcomes. And look, you got to understand one thing. This is, whose money is this anyway? This is the taxpayers' money. We, the people, the state of Texas. It's not the school district's money. So when you start talking about underfunding schools, you know, school districts, they get their revenue and their funding sources from local, state, and federal sources. About 45% comes from state, 8% comes from federal, and 47% comes from local. So when you remove, and of course, school districts are enrollment-based. So when a student is gone,
I actually think Andy agrees with you because he's nodding. So I want to thank the panel.
Thank you.
Really, education is the bedrock upon which we build tomorrow's leaders and create a thriving society. Yet today's realities, low math scores, exhausted teachers, and budget shortfalls threaten that foundation. As Texas faces a major budget deficit and teachers struggle to stay in classrooms, the question isn't just about improving numbers, but ensuring students and educators have the tools to succeed. The president is always the time for action, and only with meaningful investment in schools can the promise of a quality education be secured for all Texans. Thank you very much for joining us on Crisis in the Classroom. I'm Armstrong Williams.